So summer is drawing to a close, and I wanted to talk to you about all the amazing books that I read. I had quite a few 5 stars, some hits, some misses. So without further ado, let's jump into the books. So starting the month of June, I picked up Next Year in Havana by Chanel Cleaton, and I rated this 5 stars. You might have seen me talk about this recently in the historical fiction recommendations video. If you haven't, go ahead and click the link here. After her grandmother passes away, Marisol is tasked with going to Cuba for the very first time to spread her grandmother's ashes. And while she is there, she's also learning more about Cuban culture and what it's like to live in Cuba post Castro's demise. What I most appreciate about Elisa's point of view is learning about all the different events that were leading up to the revolution, and also seeing the perspective of what the aristocratic families were not just experiencing in the sense of having to be exiled and leave Cuba, but also what took place and what happened to the families that were left behind. I overall just love this story. I really gushed about this a lot in my previous video, so I won't spend too much time on that here, but I definitely recommend this story a lot if you're curious about learning about Cuban history, learning about what it was like prior to Castro taking over the country as well as after that, and the kind of divide, unfortunately, that developed between people that were living in Miami and other places in the States and just outside of Cuba, and then those that were living in Cuba during the time of Castro's regime. So I forgot to mention that June is Caribbean Heritage Month, and so with that, it is also Read Caribbean Month. So there are quite a few books on here that I read and loved that were written by authors that were from the Caribbean, so just be prepared for that. So the next book, obviously, is going to be The Farming of Bones by Edwidge Danticat. This is a historical fiction novel that is set in the Dominican Republic. We are following Amabel, who is a Haitian woman who works as a maid in a prominent family in the Dominican Republic, and she's pretty much lived there since she was 8 years old. She was orphaned at a very young age, and because of that, she is struggling with knowing where her community is, where her sense of belonging truly is. She feels a connection and a kinship with the family that she's working for because she pretty much grew up with the young lady who she has served most of her life. And so there's a very complex, weird relationship because even though she's working for them, she feels like she's a part of their family and she has a sense of loyalty to them that is somewhat challenged because of the different events that take place in this story. This story was very much heartbreaking, and it really illustrates the narrative around the events that took place in the 1937 massacre in the Dominican Republic, where thousands of Haitian people were killed and also were abused while they were forced to leave the Dominican Republic and go back to Haiti. It's history that I really did not know much about, unfortunately, before picking up this book. But again, it kind of goes back to why I love historical fiction so much, because I get to learn more about events that were taking place not just in the US, but all over the world, and getting the perspective from people that actually lived in these countries during these horrific events. One thing that I noticed in reading this book was the eugenics propaganda that was used by the Dominican government during this time to justify this massacre and justify the pushing out of all of these Haitian people out of the Dominican Republic that were just trying to be in the DR to work, and they were actually pulled from Haiti in previous years and decades prior for this work of being, maids and servants and working the cane fields. The specific conversation about working the cane fields and how tiresome and dangerous that work really is brought up a lot in the story as well. And it was just really disheartening and painful to read about how much history was just doomed to repeat itself over and over again. I've heard such amazing things about this author's work in the past, and I'm so happy that I was able to pick up this book and read it during Caribbean Heritage Month, and this will not be my last Danticat book for sure. Also, I gave The Farming of Bones 5 stars. The next book that I read in the month of June was The Vanishing Girls by Callie Browning, and I gave this book 4 stars. This is a historical mystery thriller that is set in Barbados during the 1970s, late 70s, I believe, and early 80s. The two perspectives that we're following in this story is Holden and Eileen. Holden is a young man who recently inherited his father's funeral business, and is trying to keep it afloat. And Eileen is looking for a job, and this is set during the recession that took place in Barbados during the 1980s, so it was hard to come by to find jobs, and it was hard to find people who were willing to work in a funeral parlor at the time. So when Eileen and Holden first meet, Holden is very much skeptical that Eileen would want to do this kind of work, but she's desperate, and so she's just willing to work anywhere and takes on the role with open arms. Around the time that Eileen takes on this job, there's actually a serial killer that is going through the island. As the bodies are piling up, Holden and Eileen take it upon themselves to figure out who is committing these crimes and to bring them to justice. Holden is very uptight, and he really takes his father's legacy very seriously. And while that could be very much admired, sometimes he holds it a little bit too tightly where it seems to hurt others in the process. And not in like a horrible way, but just in the sense of he just wants to do the very best that he can. And unfortunately that causes him to be very focused and have a tunnel vision. And, you know, anyone else who wants to get in the way, he kind of just bulldozes over them and doesn't really take note of having a lot of empathy in that regard. While Eileen has a lot of secrets and doesn't even give Holden her last name. And she, as a woman during this time, she is very much nervous and afraid. And, you know, the fact that there is someone who is on the loose just going after women in this way, it keeps her up at night. And you see that in getting her perspective, you have more of an understanding of what it was like to be a woman during these times. And also the fact that it's affecting her differently than it was Holden, because she's a woman, she's definitely could be a target. Overall, I really did enjoy the story. I loved the thriller part of it. I liked that it was very much like, it caught me off guard. I did not see who it was coming at all. And there was a slow burn romance aspect of this story that I was not expecting, but it didn't bother me. So if you're kind of thrown off by that when there's romance in your thrillers, then just be prepared for that. But it really wasn't heavy-handed at all. It was more of like a surprise, and definitely the focus was obviously the case and figuring out, you know, who did it. One thing I want to note is that this is a follow-up to the novel The Girl with Hazel Eyes. And if you didn't read that book before this one, there's a plot twist and a big reveal that happens at the end that kind of loses its luster and loses its excitement. That happened to me because I hadn't read the book, and so I got to the end and I was like, oh, I'm like, man, this probably would have been a really big reveal if I would have read the first book. But in any case, I do recommend it if you're interested in a mystery thriller that's set in the Caribbean. The next book that I read was Thicker Than Water by Kerry Washington, and this is a memoir. I rated this book 4 stars, and I absolutely really enjoyed it. So this is a memoir following Kerry Washington. If you are familiar with her, she is a very prominent actress and producer, and she starred in many different shows and films. But yeah, I personally, one thing I do know about Kerry Washington, other than her being very talented, is that she's extremely private. And so when I heard that she was coming out with a memoir, I was shocked, and I knew that I had to get my hands on it. I had to figure out what would propel her or what would cause her to write a story about her life and share intimate, private things. And one thing that I did notice is when you read the first paragraph in this memoir that she shares about how she just doesn't want to hide. She definitely wanted to share her story in her own words, on her own terms, and I really do appreciate that. A lot of the things that Kerry was talking about and dealing with in this story growing up was things that I could kind of relate to. She shared a lot about how she tried to be perfect and was using her perfectionist persona to kind of bring some like stability in her family and in her community and things like that, and how she was somewhat living a double life and duplicate life. She'd be like a good girl here and then she'd be wild on another time, you know, and how she really wasn't taking the time to get to know who she was during that time. But yeah, a lot of those things, like not everything, but some of those aspects of it, like being a perfectionist and things like that, I could kind of relate to. I did not expect that when I was reading this story. There's quite a few different similarities in how she, not really in how she grew up, but in the way that she perceived herself and perceived her ability to kind of control what was around her. As always, when I read a memoir, I really do appreciate when any person takes the time out to share their story with us, personal struggles that they could have kept to themselves, but they chose to share with the world. So I greatly do appreciate it. And so whether or not you're a Kerry Washington fan, I do recommend this one. Next up, I picked up The Leftover Woman by Jean Kwok, and this is a mystery thriller, I would say, and I rated this 4.5 stars. So in this story, we follow Jasmine and Heather. Jasmine has recently arrived to New York City from China, and she's looking for a fresh start, while Heather is a publishing executive who is living in New York City and has a wonderful family, and she's just trying to handle it all and do it all. From the first 50 pages, I was completely locked into this story, and I read this in 48 hours. I could not put this book down. Even when I had to put it down because I was working, I was so ready to pick it back up. So that's all I'm going to say about this book. If you're interested in any type of thriller that has a little bit of a literary fiction family drama associated with it, I highly recommend this book. If you're in a reading slump, definitely pick this book up. Next up is The Dragon Reborn by Robert Jordan, and this is a high fantasy, epic fantasy series that is following a character called the Dragon Reborn. In every age, there is a fight towards moving towards the light and moving towards the dark. And this pivotal figure's decision on whether to serve the dark or the light really affects the rest of the world. Whether the Wheel of Time itself is going to move towards technological advancements and progress, or if the wheel is going to be broken and they are sent back to the Dark Ages. There are quite a few characters in this story that are surrounding this kind of center point character that have their own abilities and strengths and struggles, but we're essentially following all these people as they are making their decisions and figuring out what their place is in the greater story, or in the, Wheel of Time itself. I gave this book a 3.5 stars. For the most part, I did enjoy it. It was a bit slow for me. There was quite a few chapters where I'm like, okay, can we kind of progress? I did like a lot of the different perspectives we were able to follow. So I liked following Matt's and parents' perspectives and seeing them evolve and change. The thing I love the most about this series is the various amount of cultures and traditions and various demographics that you get to see. The world is so vast, and that is one thing I really do enjoy learning as I continue to read this series. Next is Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, and I gave this book 3 stars. Now, I know y'all are gonna come for me, so let me just get my points out first and then we can continue. But Pachinko is a multi-generational family saga that is following a family as they're moving from Korea to Japan, and explores multiple different themes of belonging, trust, and even aspects of belief and religion through the lens of various characters. So before I get into what I didn't like, let's get into what I did enjoy about the story. I really enjoyed the tenderness that you saw with the fathers towards their children in the story. I like the perspective of seeing Korean immigrants in Japan, and how they were treated by Japanese nationals while they were there. I'm very intrigued by the different immigrant stories, and particularly immigrant stories outside of the United States. One thing that was a pleasant surprise was that there were a few characters who were believers, who were Christians, and they really did take their faith seriously and wanted to treat people and love people in a Christ-like way. While I enjoyed a lot about this story, there were a few things that put me off. One of them was the amount of sexual content and vulgar conversations that were in this book. There were whole chapters that I think were completely unnecessary and did not add anything to the overall plot or the development of the main characters that we were following. I wish that these chapters and this particular content just was not in this book, because I definitely would have rated this if higher. But unfortunately, that's why I rated it as low as I did. So let me know in the comments below what you thought about Pachinko, and if there's something that I was missing. But yeah, that was my overall thoughts. Next was Summer on the Bluffs by Sunny Hostin, and I rated this 3.5 stars to round it up to a 4. This was I'm trying to think of how I can describe this book. So in this story, we have Amma, who is the godmother to 3 young women who are, I believe, in their mid-20s, early 30s. And she owns a beach house in the Bluffs, Oak Bluffs, I believe it's called. And she's looking to eventually pass this house on to one of her goddaughters. She doesn't have any children of her own, and so she sees her goddaughters as her own children. And so that's part of the first, I would say, couple 30-ish pages to this story, the kind of the bare bones of it, and I don't want to say more than that. But in this, we are able to follow each of these young women and learn more about their backstories and where they came from, what they endured, where they currently are now, and what their personal struggles are. We also get to learn more about Amma and her husband Omar's backstory, how they met, their experiences being young, gifted, and Black essentially, and becoming part of the upper echelon in Black society in New York City during, I believe it was like the 1960s-ish, 60s, 70s, I think. Yeah, I did enjoy that part. I enjoyed the amount of history that's talked about in this book. And I did like following each of the young women's perspectives, learning more about them and the things that made them connect with each other. And even though they weren't physically related to each other, they did have this kinship that they explore more in the book. This book had a lot of heartfelt moments and had a lot of secrets that were revealed that really had me gasping audibly. I just was not expecting them. And yeah, I can see this being a great beach read for anyone who wants like a mostly lighthearted, there's some heavier topics, but mostly lighthearted book. But while I did enjoy those aspects that I talked about, there were a couple things that I didn't really care for. One was there was quite a few, explicit, sexual scenes or spicier scenes in this story, and particularly just following one of the characters. But you know me, I don't like spice. So also, two of the characters in the story kind of seemed to me like caricatures. I'll leave it there. I don't want to spoil anything, but like two of the characters that were in there kind of, particularly the white characters, I'm just gonna say two of the white characters kind of was giving like caricatures. They didn't really seem to me like they could be all the way real. There were certain things that were kind of played up in their personalities that it was a little bit excessive to me. Well, that's just me, my perspective. But all in all, if you're looking for pretty much a light beach read and with a lot of tea to spill, then I recommend this book. Next is Something Good by Vanessa Miller, and I gave this 4 stars. In this story, we're following 3 different women, and they are all connected by a very prominent event that takes place with one of the external characters in the story, and we're learning about how they are able to cope with this tragedy that takes place and their different struggles that happen. So like, for example, one of the women, her son was in a major accident and it kind of derailed his life. He had a football scholarship. He wasn't able to do that anymore. And she's, working to take care of him. And it's causing a little bit of not that in particular, but there's a little bit of resentment and hardship that comes up because of the medical bills and whatnot. I like the story a lot. I appreciated the different perspectives and how each of the women were in different stages of life. Each of those women are not perfect. They have their shortcomings and are working through how to overcome their personal struggles. And I love the themes of forgiveness, family, and love that are shown throughout the story. This is, I guess, marketed as Christian fiction, and I really loved how the people that did know Jesus, that they were able to show Christ's love to those that were around them in a very practical and tangible way, that they were struggling with forgiveness and really trusting God in certain aspects, and they were really honest about that. And I love that that was shown in this story. So if you're looking for a domestic drama that has a very satisfying and enjoyable end, then I recommend this one. Next, I read The Townsend Family Recipe for Disaster by Shauna Robinson, and I gave this book 5 stars. In this book, we're following May, and she is getting married, but she is terrified because she is inviting her family from her dad's side of the family that she never really connected with, and they rejected all of her wedding invitations. Also, she's struggling with her relationship with her in-laws. She wants to be closer to them, but she's afraid that if she is her true self around them, that she will feel rejected. And I'll share more about why later. But essentially, we're following her as she is doing everything that she can to get to the bottom of why her mom and her dad's side of the family just never got along. She's also biracial. And so the narrative that was told to her was that her grandmother on her dad's side, who's Black, just never accepted that he would marry a white woman. But May thinks that there's more to the story, and she's determined to figure out what's going on before her wedding. I absolutely loved this story so much. I really felt for May. You could tell she's really looking for belonging and acceptance. She's been hurt in the past by obviously by the black side of her family, because she just felt rejected by them, but also with her mom's side of the family, who she spent the most time around. There's one instance where a family member had told May that when she had her hair in braids that she looked like a thug, and that, on top of a bunch of other things that she shares in the story, really just obviously made me very mad. It shows why she was very hesitant with connecting with that side of the family, and as she got older, she kind of distance herself from her mom's side of the family. So it left her in this space of, as an adult, really feeling rootless, not really feeling connected to either side and not really knowing where she truly came from. This story really illustrates how complicated and complex familial love can truly be, how much secrecy, prejudice, and resentment can really not just affect you, but also future generations. And also the importance of just being honest about who you are and how you feel about certain things, and not just balling everything up in order to make everyone else feel comfortable. Ooh, that's a little bit of a self-evaluation, Gabby. Wow, self-revelation there. But yes, I absolutely adored this book. I loved Shauna Robinson's book, Must Love Books, and she really did knock it off the park with this one. This is a new release. It came out in July, so if you haven't picked it up, I highly recommend that you do. Next was Miss Lattimore's Letter by Susanna Lane. This is a historical romance that is following Sophie, and she is a young woman who's, I think, in like her mid to late 20s. So, back in like the Regency era, that was pretty much means that you're going to be a governess or something. You're going to be an old maid. So she really has no prospects on the horizon. She's been tasked to being a companion to her younger cousin, as her younger cousin is coming out into society and is looking for a match. But because Sophie is kind of a wallflower, if you will, she observes a lot, and she observes something that for some reason she just feels like she needed to intervene. And so she sends a letter to a certain someone and gives them information that radically changes a bunch of different matches that were, happening this current season. And because of that, it leads her to becoming a little bit of a matchmaker, even though she does not want to be. So I really like this story. It was really funny, lighthearted, great, just romance story, and just a fun way to pass the time. I really do love Susanna Lane's books. I've read at least, this is my third book that I've read from her, and again, it's just really good. I gave this 5 stars if I didn't mention it before. So if you're looking for just a light, fun, historical romance, then pick this one up. Next book that I read this summer was In the Country We Love, My Family Divided by Diane Guerrero, and I gave this 4 stars. This is a memoir that's following Diane as we see her throughout her journey of being an American citizen, born here in the US, but with undocumented parents. This story was heartbreaking to read, to say the least, because we see her upbringing and the way that she and her family had to move about in society because of the fact that her parents were here undocumented, and also what took place when they were deported when she was about the age of 14, 15. I didn't really know much about this actress prior to reading this memoir. I had heard about her name a few times, and I also found out that she was actually in Encanto, but I hadn't watched any of her other films or TV shows prior to this, so I was fully going to this story just to learn more about her and her experience and her upbringing, and I was very much shook and really impacted. This book is very powerful, just to get a perspective of someone who has experienced a lot of loss and had to be really resilient in the midst of everything that was going on around her. Yeah, I think regardless of what you feel about or how you land when it comes to immigration reform, I feel like reading the stories of those that were both undocumented as well as those that have undocumented family members, is worth the read, just to gain a different perspective and see another point of view. The next book that I read was An Ember in the Ashes by Saba Tahir, and I gave this 5 stars. This was a reread. I've talked about this book multiple times on my channel, so please watch any of the other videos that I've made, including my 2023 top reads video, and you'll see how much I really do love this book. But I'll just say that I loved it just as much the second time around. And the last book that I read in the month of August and the last book of the summer was Homegoing by Ya Gyazi, and I gave this book 3.5 stars. So this is a multi-generational family saga. We're following each character in each chapter as we are following their movement from Ghana to the United States ultimately. We're starting off following two half-sisters who have the same mom, different fathers in Ghana, and then we're following their lineage as one becomes married to a English nobleman of some kind in Ghana, while the other one is captured and sold into slavery. For the most part, I did enjoy this story. I liked hearing the different perspectives of each character, each family member, and learning more about their experience and their connection to their previous history. Some who unfortunately don't have any connection because of slavery, and then different familial issues that take place. I like that we were able to see various periods of time and different events through the lives of everyday people. While I did enjoy the story, there are a few notes that I did have. One of them was I kind of wish that we didn't follow as many characters because we were limited in getting only their point of view in each of the chapters. And I feel like this is a pretty short book and we went through it, I feel like, a little bit too quickly for my taste. I would have preferred either having not as many characters but spending more time with them, or if we were following a lot of characters and spending a lot of time with them and the book itself was longer. So instead of 300 pages, that was maybe like 400, 500, but that's just me, my personal note. And then also one thing that I didn't really care for was that because of the fact, I think that might be part of it, because of the fact that we were following a different character every chapter, there was a high emphasis on, you know, some spicier, explicit things that were happening with each of the characters. Even though it wasn't worded super explicitly in some ways, I feel like it was kind of excessive for like every single person that we're following, that we had to have this, you know, big sexual experience that takes place in each and every one of the chapters. But again, that's me. I'm always going to be a stickler when it comes to spice. But if you like, you know, multi-generational stories, especially ones that are kind of outlined like a short story collection, then I do recommend this book. Those are all the books that I read this summer. I had quite a few 5 stars, if you probably heard, and I overall feel like I had a great reading season during the summer. So with that, thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment below and let me know what was your favorite book that you read this summer. And thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.